Boom. Okay. Saved from technical difficulty. So back live with Renee Hatcher. Renee, welcome to the Ujamaa Hour.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is
Absolutely.
great.
So why don't you tell us a bit just first about your work and about your approach to cooperatives and cooperation, and perhaps if you have any thoughts about this term capital, the ways that we've used it today, and
Mm.
potentially the ways that you've seen it used. How you think we should maybe approach that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a human rights and a community development lawyer, and that's at least how I like to think about my work. A lot of what I do is work with small businesses, nonprofits, focusing more lately on working with cooperatives, other kinds of solidarity economy enterprises, certain types of social enterprises, right, where people are really trying to rethink the ways in which we build businesses, the way in which we manage businesses together, but also thinking about kind of the collectivity and the well-being of their overall communities in that process. And so I really appreciate that I get to work with folks who want to think about how do we transform our local economy, how do we create new kinds of or new ideas about what a business is, what an enterprise is, and what are kind of the underlying purposes behind it beyond just making money. So I get to do that work from right now from John Marshall Law School. I run a clinic there providing free legal support to nonprofits and small businesses. One of the things I'm really excited about that I've kind of been plugging is that we're currently going through a rebranding and we'll be changing the name from the Business Enterprise Law Clinic to the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Law Clinic, which was really important to me in part just to, one, claim the work that we've already been doing, but also to signal to folks that there really is at least the legal support to create new types of businesses and to support all of the, I think, really wonderful and imaginative work that's already happening in the city of Chicago. Um, so, I started my practice just working with small businesses, mostly on the south and west side of Chicago at the Chicago Lawyers Committee. And after a while, started to do some reflection around, like, at least what were the limitations of that work. And most of the businesses that we were working with, as a sole owner, um, they in some cases were perhaps like transitioning or trying to think about starting their own business because the 9 to 5 wasn't working for them, or they wanted to just have more independence, I think. And I started to think a lot about like what the limitations of that model is. Essentially, if everybody's going to start their own business, one, there's only so many services and certain kinds of products that we need in any given neighborhood at one time. But then more importantly, really, what's the connection to community and how are these businesses going to be grounded? And I think that, as you've been talking about, the cooperative model is simply a different kind of community engagement. It's a different level of accountability, in part because it's a number of people coming together and governing a business and managing a business together, right? And it also provides, I think, a certain level of just social support, right? Social support in starting a business typically is a long process. And then also just in thinking about, and we'll love to talk more about the different forms of capital, but also, starting a business as a cooperative, you are already engaging so many people in terms of just stakeholders that can come in, and maybe one individual doesn't necessarily have the startup capital to start a particular venture, but a number of people coming together and putting in small pots of money, right, and a collective venture also, I think, can help to disperse like the risk of the business, but also ensure that there's really just, again, a strong network of support as you continue to grow the business, particularly at the outset. But as you've been saying, and I'm sure as you mentioned in the last segment, a cooperative has so many additional benefits. And I think in thinking through the different forms of capital, right? The 8 forms of capital, right? A cooperative so often embodies that in the sense that is drawing, for example, of the experience and the wealth of knowledge that so many different people bring, or the different perspectives that people bring, or the different skill sets, right? And so you see within the cooperative structure, I think a lot more, for example, skill sharing, or you see the kinds of then social networks that are created just by becoming a member of a cooperative or being a worker owner at a cooperative, right? The kinds of deep and thick relationships that are built as people really are building trust and governing a business together. And, you know, the other point that I also wanted to make is this wonderful point that you made, is that we're just not trying to create more businesses. We have to think about, how are these businesses going to be accountable to the people that they serve, the communities that they occupy? What is that going to look like? What are some things that we want to demand, right, of businesses, in the way that we want to also kind of set rules in terms of how we engage and build with each other. You know, businesses can have a huge impact on the way that communities develop, flourish, or the ways in which people are cut off, and don't necessarily have access. So I think that, you know, again, cooperative development, solidarity economy, and thinking about how do we develop the solidarity economy in the Black community, right, is crucial in really figuring out how do we want to reimagine our own neighborhoods, how do we want to remake them. And I think cooperative development is one way in which we can move towards that.
Excellent, excellent. So I am, of course, a co-facilitator with Joan Federo of the Cooperation for Liberation Study and Working Group. And one of the things that, Joan is very keen on stressing, whenever we are talking about planning and moving forward with things, is the skill building component. So I'd like to maybe draw on your knowledge about what are the sort of skill sets and things that we might need to be thinking about building up if we're actually going to stimulate, a cooperative momentum inside of our community.
Well, so I think a couple of things, right? I think first and foremost, right? I was talking to some folks not too long ago, and I kind of posed this question. It's like, so what do we do when, the steel mills close and the paycheck just isn't enough? Like, right, how do we sustain ourselves when, big box stores pack up shop, or, post-industrial business X goes overseas, and the kinds of jobs now that a lot of people, or generally the economy, is producing simply just is not enough to actually sustain, right, a life of dignity. So what do we do in those situations, right? And the thing that sustains us is our relationships. So more than anything else, like, the key to me, even beyond thinking about the skill sets that are necessary to actually build these kinds of enterprises, right, is us building deep relationships and authentic relationships with each other. And in doing that, we put ourselves in the right place to actually think about, how do we build enterprises that sustain the kinds of lives and provide the kinds of things that we need. And how do we do that in a collective way that's accountable to community and based in community? And so to me, like, first and foremost is organizing, is relationship building. It's trying to figure out, how do we actually think about doing that and making that kind of commitment, and also thinking about transforming ourselves as we try to transform, the local economy, and doing some of this work. In terms of skills beyond that, what I would say is that so much of it is, and this might sound, this is very true from what I've seen in terms of just cooperative businesses. So much of it is, right, really the skill set of cooperating, really the skill set of not only building those deep, thick relationships, but then figuring out, how do we go about making decisions on a consensus model? Or how do we want to move through certain and tough decisions, right? if, when times get tough in a particular business, or in the first couple of years when you're trying to get your business and push it into the black, like how do you think about what that contingency plan is, but how do you actually exercise and lead with solidarity of all the members that are involved, and how you do that more than anything else. And then beyond that, in terms of skill sharing, so for example, I absolutely don't think that anyone needs to have, you can run a successful business and not necessarily go to school to be in business, right? And I think that there are a couple of things that might be useful. And one, just understanding, the operating expenses of the business, and what, understanding either the services that you're providing or the products that you're selling and the target markets, right? But I think a lot of that really, is and can be built within our communities, and in part, if we're building community economies, the folks who are members and based in those communities have the best understanding of what the needs are, what the gaps are, right? And so I think in a lot of ways, cooperative development, thinking about really grassroots enterprise development is a more successful model, in part because the people that are building these enterprises are the same folks who actually need access to these services or to these products, and understand, and also understand the culture. And so what I've seen, in my experience, a lot of the incubation of these new kinds of cooperatives or solidarity economy enterprises, particularly in the Black community, right? It's almost an organizing effort that's really coming out of culture, and also coming out of the deeper understanding of residents who live in a particular neighborhood that know, yeah, we don't have childcare here, so let's start a childcare cooperative, or or we need more or less a culturally kind of solid catering company here, and trying to figure out how we can engage that business, and not only maybe having a storefront, but also catering kinds of events, or family events, or resident events in the community. And so I think in a lot of ways, the skills really come from the actual building of the business. And, what I say is that, in terms of just, I usually provide the legal support. The legal support is certainly not even one of the most important parts of the business. Absolutely. And I am of the philosophy that we can come in and teach folks the basics of, kind of the legal basis that they need to know to run their business, that you don't necessarily constantly need to consult a lawyer. But that's not necessarily the most important part. Of course, we want to make sure that you're on a good footing and understand the regulations in your particular industry. But at the same time, the core of it is really making sure that people can make decisions together, can operate from just a different kind of philosophy and a framework of solidarity, and trying to build their business. And then in doing that, making sure that they, are being accountable to community. But the flip side of that is that, in building those relationships, people want to engage your business. People want to find ways in which to collaborate and support each other. And that can mean the world of difference in terms of either being successful 5 years out, or not necessarily, sustaining the business after 5 years. Mm-hmm. So I would say there are many skills, but the biggest skill set really is building relationships with people, and organizing and making decisions together in a way that is only going to further the ultimate goal, which hopefully is cooperation, but collective kind of thriving of the members of a particular enterprise or initiative or cooperative.
All right. And so, when we first connected, through Joan, and just kind of decided to kind of take conversations further. I bumped into on your wall, and you can tell me if this discussion needs not go further, but you're from a black political dynasty, am I understanding?
I wasn't expecting you to say that, Michael. Um, Yeah, no, I mean, I'm really proud of that. So my father, Richard Hatcher, was was the first black mayor of a major city in the
That
United
was a
States,
discussion whether or not
right?
he was or wasn't, right?
He was.
Yeah.
I mean, he was. He got elected as the mayor of Gary at the same time that Carl Stokes got elected as the mayor of Cleveland, Ohio. And I think what more or less what that looked like. My father was elected first. Carl Stokes was sworn in. He was elected afterwards, but sworn in first. But beyond that, he was very involved with the civil rights movement. He was the founding board president of Trans Africa. He was, very active in the national political campaign when Jesse Jackson ran for president. But more importantly, just as someone who's committed to Black liberation and Black political power, and so absolutely very proud of his accomplishments. And in some ways, I like to think that in some way the work that I'm doing is a continuation of a lot of the things that he was trying to do and thinking about Black political power and how do we exercise that in the current democratic system that we have, but then also thinking about the limitations of that, particularly if we're not necessarily trying to democratize the economy, not also thinking about Black economic power, but in the collective sense, not necessarily just in terms of creating a few more Black millionaires. Right. And I think, that speaks to generally how do we create or how do we transform not only our political system, but our economic system to ensure that we're improving people's lives, right? And that making sure that everyone has access to what they need and can live a dignified life in this country.
Absolutely. And so to that point, how do we, I mean, in this sort of tumultuous political season, how do we think about how politics will impact our ability to do the work that we are thinking about doing around, cooperative economy and solidarity economy and the development of these structures that will sustain our community? How does politics impact that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And one of the reasons I love my work in part is because so much of it is really reimagining what currently is and people building institutions, right, that actually they control and that serve their needs, right? And I think that there's something very attractive about that in the sense that we know historically Black folks have largely been left out of so many of the state-run or government programs in different ways, or have not had the same kind of access or experienced both oppression but consistent discrimination from the state, even in the different kinds of opportunities that are afforded, right, by the government. And so I think there's something very, important to me and Black folks having the right to self-determination in this country and building sovereign institutions that kind of serve their needs that they control is one way in which to do that. But the other side of that is at some point you gotta deal with the state, right? And we've seen, and that is a lesson that we have to learn from history. You talked about the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, right? We know that they experienced discrimination in terms of the U.S. Department of Agriculture or just in the ways in which they were treated by local government and trying to actually build and grow, right, Black farmers and the opportunities that they had in the South and continue to, that continues to be an issue. There was a whole round of litigation about this in terms of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. But example after example, we know, and that's also one of the lessons from collective courage and looking at the historical past of Black cooperative development, there was always a backlash. And a lot of times that backlash was was at least implicated the state, if not was directly coming from the state in some instances. And so you know that you at some point we're going to have to deal with the state, so that also has to be, that constantly has to be a part of our strategy. And that doesn't necessarily mean just engaging in electoral politics, but also thinking about what the landscape looks like and what are some of the ways in which we need to neutralize the state to accomplish some of the things that we need to accomplish, or what in what ways do we need to build and leverage power to direct the state to do the things that we need, and reimagining and building out a larger vision. And so it's not a either or. Certainly for me, it's a both and it's just thinking about how do we link those two things. And so I see that time and time again, right? And I think that's very prevalent in terms of the conversations between police violence and economic state violence, right? And then thinking about the kinds of experiences that Black folks have in this country. One of the main examples that constantly I come back to is like the experience of Freddie Gray when he was murdered by the cops in Baltimore, right? Not many people know that he was also, suffered from lead poisoning because of lead paint that plagued a whole host of Black low-income neighborhoods in the city of Baltimore that went unaddressed by the city of Baltimore, the housing development, right? And the ways in which environmental racism really was killing him at the point that he encountered those police officers that ultimately killed Freddie Gray in Baltimore, right? So there's a lot of different ways in which Black life is threatened, that we have to make those connections and also incorporate those kinds of learnings into our organizing work, and in thinking about not only how do we build the institutions that we need, but also how do we organize and navigate electoral power or state power in ways that are going to sustain us and actually help us build the work we're trying to build.
Absolutely, absolutely, and to the point about what we faced, in the course of building these cooperative endeavors. One of the most poignant moments for me that came out of the Cooperation for Liberation study and working group was when one of our members, Renee, at the end of our course of, reading through Collective Courage, we were just doing sort of a recap and a reflection period, and I certainly, think this is safe. In fact, no, we shared this in our recap video, so I'm sure that she's okay with me sharing it. But, she talked about being just very devastated about understanding, do we ever win, right? Is it just, is it possible? Like, what Dr. Nimbar talks about in there is brutal. And certainly the history of Black people in America is brutal. And the history of Black folks globally is brutal. But, what does it look like? Do we ever win? And what happened in the room at that moment was very much, what you're talking about in the course of cultivating relationships. We had spent, 7 weeks kind of, running through this text. So in that room, people pulled together in the course of that conversation. And what happened was a round robin occurred. And in that round robin, it was, what is it that you do to ground yourself when it seems like we are at that very moment as devastated as we will ever be? And, I say this for, all the youth, who felt like that Trump was an apocalyptic president. And, I talk about, Bush 2 was an apocalyptic president. And I remember when Bush 1 was an apocalyptic president. So I mean, Clinton was an apocalyptic president, so
Right.
yes. So I'm certainly, very, very heartened by the discussion around what relationships mean and how critical they are to this work and sustaining us as we do this work, which, can at moments be diminishing.
Yes. No, I completely agree. And that also comes back to your point of thinking beyond financial capital, right? Thinking about all the different forms of capital. But, more importantly, again, I think the at the core of so much of this is really, and all we have when everything else falls away, or when any one of us gets in a tough spot, right, are our relationships and the people that we build relationships with, and thinking about how do we do that and leverage those in a way that will collectively lead us a little bit closer to liberation, right?
Indeed, indeed.
Mhm.
Well, if you will stay on with me for a moment, I just want to announce that we are this Sunday hosting another session of Cooperation for Liberation that's going to be at the Breathing Room, 1434 West 51st Street from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. All of those notes will be posted within BEBA. And this Sunday, what we'll be focusing on is the forum and the report back. So we'll be hosting a co-op forum and report back. You know, you see that ballot there, Republican, Democrat, or the people. We hope that you are voting with the third option. So again, we're at the Breathing Room space, 3 p.m. to 5 p.m., 1434 West 51st Street. And that will be posted very shortly in BEBA. And are there any sort of last words that you want to, share with us and think reflections that we might think on as we move on from this discussion we've had today?
Mm. Let's see. So one, I just want to thank you for doing this. I mean, I think this is fantastic, and actually starting a dialogue about how do we think about, not only just building Black economic power on the individual level, but how do we build it collectively? And then, I want to encourage folks just to plug in, right? To plug into the Cooperation for Liberation group, to think about, even in the context of their larger work or some of the organizing work that they're currently doing, whether it's around economic transformation or not, or Black economic power generally, think about how it plays out in every part, right, of society, and thinking about how the current economic system does simply not work for the majority of Black folks. And once you arrive at that, it's like, well, what are you going to do about it?
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many different ways in which I think we can start to transform ourselves to think differently about about our role as consumers, about our role as workers, about our role as just engaged and members of community and just with our folk, and how we might operate differently based upon that. And so I would just encourage folks to keep exploring, to keep pushing, to try to find ways to stay grounded and do self-care as we deal with all of this, as we're inundated with sometimes what feels like overwhelming bad news, right? How important it is really for us to not give up and to sustain each other and actually, support each other as we continue to try to at least change a little bit of the world.
Absolutely. All received and transmitted. I want to, we are 3 minutes past, and I'm very punctual. So, I don't want to hang on too long, but I do want to open up the line, open up the floor for folks in the comment section. If you do have any questions for myself or our guest tonight, Renee Hatcher, please, go ahead and post those in the comment section. We'll hang on the line for this few minutes delay, or this minute delay, I think it is, that the video transmits. So if you have questions, please post them in the comments. We want to make sure that, we have covered all of the things that are really critical to you in terms of understanding cooperation, understanding collectivism, and understanding where we are going in terms of all of the forms of capital we have to maximize and grow our community. So any comments, please post them in the questions. Well, questions in the comments. There we go. And I want to shout out, Sister Safia there. I see you. Right on, Black Power. Sister Safia of Your Bountiful Harvest, and someone who is a family that is tremendously steeped in the history of collectivism. So we really appreciate the Rashid tribe there. And Black Power to Sister Tequila Shabazz, the founder of the Bridge Embassy for Black America, where we are building and protecting Black. So, are there any questions out there? Any questions, any comments, anything that anyone needs to express? And that's why this timer is always beneficial, because now that it's run out, I don't know exactly where this delay is at in terms of what I'm looking at on the screen. Oh, okay. We've got a question here from Antoine Belmer. Would the first step in thinking about starting a collective be a need? So I don't see many black businesses on my side of town. So yes, what's sort of the first step in possibly defining, what the need is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think that in looking at both the historical account and taking a survey of cooperatives that currently exist, right? The ones that are the most successful, and businesses generally, right, is when they actually feel a need or a gap, right? And also sometimes it's in the delivery of it. Maybe it provides access to a whole lot more folks in terms of the price point or whatever that looks like. But I do think that kind of approach where you're first like taking a survey of what the actual needs are is the right way to go. Conversely, for example, like a lot of the clients that I work with might go to a small business development center and get market research about, well, I want to do this and let me take a survey of the kinds of businesses that currently do this. And there's a lot actually, there's a more or less, if you actually dig into the research on a lot of this, the market research is not all that effective. It's one, the way in which it's put together and the folks that actually gather that kind of research take a lot of assumptions in actually putting it together. And so what I would say is, in some ways, yeah, you have a leg up if you already have a sense what the needs and the gaps are in your community. And I think that's an ideal way to actually go about specifically for cooperative development, because not only are you creating the business, but you're actually providing something that otherwise would not be accessible to the folks in the neighborhood.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So I don't see any other questions posted, and we are 7 minutes over. And because I am a very punctual person, I want to make sure that I do, go ahead and close out the segment. I can promise this first segment went 45 minutes. This one went, about 68. I can promise this segment will not grow. We are trying to keep it very succinct and very to the point. And ultimately, we want it to be just a nibble, just a nibble. If you bite on it, then, you can go feast elsewhere, and there are lots of resources that are posted for you to feast on. So make sure you are looking out for up. Mama Sophia came in with the save. So yes, before I pick up on Mama Sophia's question, just make sure that you are looking out for those posts that are in the group, how we cooperate. So that's kind of just extending on Dr. Nimbard's work, and just saying these are the different ways that we are already cooperating in society at the present. These are ways that we've cooperated in the past, and this is what cooperation looks like. This is what the collective activity that we have been able to engage and looks like. So, every time when we get to this space of, Ujamaa and Ujamaa during Kwanzaa, and we're talking about this collective work and responsibility, and we're talking about cooperative economics, we don't necessarily just have to draw on the history. We got the present right now. We got Tight Shift. We got Detroit, Black Community Food Security Network. We have present day examples that we can touch upon. We've got Mandela, Food Cooperative in Oakland. So we have present day examples that we can touch upon, we can draw upon, that will actually help us to shift forward and remember, Sankofa, go back and come get it. To get these examples, that existed in the past, that exist in the present, and are ways that we have always organized our communities. So Mama Safia, posed the question: any advice to for-profit businesses that want to convert to a co-op? So I'm just going to frame Mama Safia's question, noting that Your Bountiful Harvest is an urban farm enterprise that Mama Safia started, and she has farmed up to, I think, a quarter acre. She could have farmed larger. So, if I'm misreading your work, Mama Safia, please forgive me. But, she does know how to, farm a lot of land. So, she can do crop planting for much larger spaces. Plug for Mama Safia. But yes, for-profit.
Yeah, really quickly. So the other thing I would probably should be mentioning is, as I mentioned at the beginning, I direct a legal clinic that provides free legal support to small businesses, nonprofits, but really focusing on cooperative development and solidarity economy enterprises. So we will be taking on new clients soon. And essentially what in terms of a for-profit business that wants to convert to a co-op, right, there might be a number of different steps for that. So there are ways in which we can actually change the legal structure that might make more sense to convert into a co-op. But then a lot of what it is really rethinking the internal governance of that business, right? Thinking about what kind of cooperative is it going to be? Is it going to be a consumer cooperative where, for example, the folks who actually might be buying the produce from the venture they're going to be members, or is it going to be a workers co-op? And we can talk through the different options, or sometimes it's even what we refer to as a hybrid or a multi-stake holder co-op, in which both consumers and workers can be the owners of that. And so I would just say, and I'll be sure to post in the group, a link to just information about our services. Again, all of our services are free. We provide legal support to cooperatives and other kind of solidarity economy enterprises, and we'll be taking on new clients soon.
All right. Ideally, that answers your question, Mama Safia. And, since I do not see any more questions in the group that posted, we are going to go ahead and close this broadcast at 12 minutes past that 1 hour mark. So yes, we are somewhat on time. So thank you very much for appearing on the Ujamaa Hour tonight, Renee. We really appreciate your presence. We appreciate your work. And I appreciate your cooperation in this matter. And so look forward to working with you in the future and onward and forward.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate this.
All right. Good evening, sis.